Good evening, dear listener. Tonight, we drift once more into the golden sands of ancient times, where the Nile River whispered secrets to those who would listen. Whether you rest comfortably in your bed or settle into a peaceful evening, I invite you to journey with me through this gentle tale of remarkable achievement. Perhaps you might share where you find yourself tonight and what draws you to these quiet moments with history. If these tranquil passages through time bring you comfort, there are many more such evenings ahead. Tonight, I shall reveal how a woman in ancient Kemet managed to ascend to the throne of Pharaoh in an age when such achievement seemed impossible. How she maintained her rule for over 2 decades while surrounded by those who questioned her authority, and why her reign became so prosperous that later rulers tried to diminish her memory completely. I'll show you the ingenious strategies she employed, the magnificent monuments that still inspire wonder today, and the profound truth about her remarkable legacy. But first, let me paint for you a picture that will illuminate the extraordinary nature of her accomplishment. Ancient Kemet enjoyed over 3,000 years of royal rule. Throughout that vast expanse of time, only a handful of women ever claimed the golden throne as pharaoh in their own right. Most endured mere months or a few brief years at most. Nefertari ruled for 22 years and transformed Kemet into the wealthiest, most influential nation on earth. This was not fortune. This was pure strategic brilliance. Before we explore how she achieved the seemingly impossible, you must understand just how revolutionary her actions truly were. In ancient Kemet, the pharaoh was not merely a political leader. The pharaoh was considered a living deity, the earthly manifestation of Horus, destined to become Osiris after death. The role was so sacred, so fundamentally masculine in Egyptian understanding, that there existed no feminine word for pharaoh in their language. When Nefertari claimed the throne, she literally had to create new ways to describe herself. Here begins the most captivating aspect of her story. Nefertari did not initially plan to become pharaoh. She began as the beloved wife of Amenhotep II, which made her queen of all Kemet. When her husband departed for the afterlife while still young, his heir was Amenhotep III. But there existed one enormous challenge. The new pharaoh was merely a child, perhaps 7 years of age. Kemet required someone to guide the kingdom until he reached maturity. Enter Nefertari. As the departed king's principal wife and the young pharaoh's stepmother, she was the natural choice to serve as regent. This arrangement was quite customary in Egyptian governance. Queen mothers and stepmothers had served as regents before. They would manage the daily administration of the kingdom, while the young pharaoh learned the arts of rulership. Then, when he reached sufficient age, usually around 16 or 18 years, they would gracefully step aside and allow him to assume full control. But Nefertari harbored different intentions. Somewhere during those initial years as regent, she made a decision that would alter Egyptian history forever. She decided she would not step aside. Instead, she would become pharaoh herself. What makes this absolutely remarkable is that she could not simply declare herself pharaoh and expect universal acceptance. Ancient Kemet was a deeply spiritual society where everything required justification through divine will and ancient tradition. If she wished to claim the throne, she needed to convince the priests, the nobles, the army, and the people that the gods themselves desired her to be pharaoh god. So how did she accomplish this miracle? This is where Nefertari's political genius truly illuminates. She did not attempt to overthrow the existing system. Instead, she worked within it, carefully bending ancient traditions just enough to support her claim without shattering them completely. First, she emphasized her royal bloodline. Nefertari was not just any queen. She was the daughter of Amenhotep I, one of Kemet's most revered pharaohs. In her carefully crafted messages, she began claiming that her father had chosen her as his heir, even though he had sons. She commissioned artwork showing Amenhotep I presenting her to the court as his successor. Whether this was historically accurate, we may never know for certain, but it was brilliant politics. Next, she addressed the religious complications. If the gods desired her to be pharaoh, there had to be divine evidence. So Nefertari created one of the most audacious religious claims in Egyptian history. She announced that she was the daughter of Amun-Ra, the king of the gods himself. According to her account, Amun-Ra conceived Nefertari to be pharaoh. This was not completely without precedent. Many pharaohs claimed divine parentage, but Nefertari expanded this concept further. She commissioned a series of reliefs at her temple in Deir el-Medina, showing her divine birth story in incredible detail. The artwork depicts Amun-Ra choosing her mother, the conception, the birth, and the gods declaring that Nefertari would be pharaoh. It was like an ancient Egyptian illustrated manuscript proving her right to rule. But here lies the most fascinating aspect of her strategy. Nefertari realized that to be accepted as pharaoh, she needed to embody the role completely. And in ancient Kemet, pharaohs were always depicted in very specific ways. They wore the false beard of kingship, the double crown, and held the crook and flail. These were not mere accessories. They were sacred symbols that transformed the wearer into a living god. So, Nefertari did something that still amazes people today. She began appearing in full pharaonic regalia, complete with the false beard. Early in her reign, some artwork shows her with feminine features, but wearing masculine royal symbols. Later images show her with a completely masculine appearance. She even modified her name, adding masculine endings to make it sound more kingly. Some people today interpret this as Nefertari denying her femininity or attempting to become a man. But this completely misunderstands the situation. Nefertari was not trying to become a man. She was trying to become pharaoh. And pharaoh was a role that transcended ordinary human gender. By adopting masculine royal imagery, she was claiming that the gods had transformed her into something beyond ordinary womanhood. She was claiming to be divine, and incredibly, it succeeded. The priests accepted her. The nobles supported her. The army followed her commands. Even young Amenhotep III, who had every reason to resent her for claiming his throne, seems to have accepted the arrangement, at least publicly. But gaining the throne was merely the beginning. Now Nefertari had to prove she deserved it. And this is where her reign becomes truly extraordinary, because she did not just maintain Kemet's power. She expanded it in ways that made her predecessors appear as novices. Let us explore what Kemet looked like when Nefertari assumed control. The kingdom was already wealthy and powerful, but it faced some serious challenges. The previous pharaohs had focused heavily on military expansion, conquering territories in Nubia and the Levant. This brought wealth through tribute and trade, but it also created constant military expenses and the risk of rebellion. Nefertari examined this situation and made a decision that proved her strategic genius. Instead of continuing the endless cycle of conquest and rebellion, she would focus on making Kemet so wealthy and powerful through trade that other nations would desire to be her allies rather than her enemies. The centerpiece of this strategy was one of the most ambitious expeditions in ancient history. Nefertari organized a massive trading expedition to the mysterious land of Punt, somewhere along the Red Sea coast, probably in modern-day Somalia or Ethiopia. This was not just a few ships carrying trinkets. This was a full-scale commercial and diplomatic mission designed to establish Kemet as the dominant trading power in the region. The expedition to Punt became legendary, and Nefertari ensured everyone knew about it. She covered the walls of her temple with detailed scenes showing Egyptian ships loaded with exotic goods, meeting with the rulers of Punt and bringing back incredible wealth. The artwork shows myrrh trees being carefully transported in pots, live animals including giraffes and leopards, gold, ivory, and precious incense. But here's what makes this expedition brilliant. Nefertari was not just collecting exotic goods for the royal treasury. She was establishing trade relationships that would make Kemet wealthy for generations. The myrrh trees were not just valuable in themselves. They were planted in Kemet, creating a domestic source of one of the most precious substances in the ancient world. The success of the Punt expedition sent a message to every other kingdom in the region. Kemet under Nefertari was wealthy, organized, and powerful enough to mount massive expeditions to distant lands. Other rulers began sending ambassadors with tribute and gifts, hoping to establish their own trading relationships. And this brings us to perhaps the most impressive aspect of Nefertari's reign. While her male predecessors and successors are remembered primarily for their military campaigns, Nefertari created wealth and stability through commerce and diplomacy. Kemet during her reign became richer than it had ever been before, and she used that wealth to fund building projects that still take your breath away today. We are speaking of construction on a scale that rivals anything built in human history. Nefertari did not just restore existing temples. She rebuilt them completely, making them larger and more magnificent than ever before. She erected massive obelisks, some of which still stand today, weighing hundreds of tons and carved from single pieces of granite, quarried hundreds of miles away. But the crown jewel of her building program was her mortuary temple, built into the cliffs of the Valley of the Queens. This was not just a tomb. It was a statement. The temple rises in 3 terraces connected by ramps, perfectly integrated into the natural rock formation. Even today, 4,500 years later, architects and engineers study this building to understand how it was designed and constructed. The temple was not just impressive because of its size or beauty. It was revolutionary because of what it represented. Every previous pharaoh had built their mortuary temple as a separate structure near their tomb. Nefertari integrated hers directly into the sacred landscape of the valley, making it part of the mountain itself. The message was clear. She was not just another ruler who happened to be buried here. She belonged to this place, and this place belonged to her. But here is where Nefertari's political genius really shows. She knew that building impressive monuments was not enough. She needed to ensure that future generations would remember her as a legitimate pharaoh, not just as a woman who temporarily seized power. So she did something that was both brilliant and dangerous. She began rewriting history. Throughout Kemet, Nefertari ordered the creation of new inscriptions and reliefs that presented her reign as part of the natural order of succession. She did not erase previous pharaohs or claim their accomplishments. Instead, she positioned herself as the rightful continuation of her father's dynasty. The artwork from her reign shows her receiving the crown directly from Amenhotep I, with young Amenhotep III standing respectfully beside her as a junior Kodash ruler. This was incredibly risky. If anyone challenged these historical claims, it could undermine her entire legitimacy. But Nefertari was betting that her success as pharaoh would be so obvious, so undeniable, that no one would dare question how she achieved it. And for over 20 years, that calculation proved correct. During her reign, Kemet experienced what historians now call a golden age. The kingdom's borders were secure, not because of constant warfare, but because potential enemies were too busy profiting from trade relationships to risk military conflict. The treasury was full, not just from tribute extracted by force, but from voluntary commercial partnerships that benefited everyone involved. Nefertari used this stability and wealth to transform Egyptian society in ways that went far beyond impressive buildings. She invested heavily in infrastructure projects that improved life for ordinary Egyptians. New roads made trade easier and faster. Expanded irrigation systems brought more land under cultivation, increasing food production and supporting population growth. She also revolutionized Egyptian religion, but not in the way you might expect. Rather than imposing new gods or dramatically changing existing practices, Nefertari became the greatest patron of traditional Egyptian religion in the kingdom's history. She restored temples that had been neglected, established new festivals, and increased offerings to the gods on a scale never seen before. This was not just piety. It was brilliant politics. By showing unprecedented devotion to the traditional gods, Nefertari reinforced her claim that the gods had chosen her to rule. Every restored temple, every new festival, every generous offering was evidence that the gods approved of her reign. How else could Kemet be so prosperous and peaceful? But perhaps the most impressive aspect of her religious policy was how she handled the priesthood. In ancient Kemet, priests were not just religious figures. They were powerful political players who controlled vast temple estates and influenced public opinion. Previous pharaohs had often struggled with priestly opposition or had to make costly concessions to maintain religious support. Nefertari took a different approach. Instead of trying to control the priests, she made them her partners. She consulted with them on major decisions, incorporated their advice into her policies, and ensured they shared in Kemet's growing prosperity. The result was unprecedented religious unity and stability. This partnership with the priesthood gave Nefertari something no previous pharaoh had enjoyed to the same degree: religious legitimacy that went beyond traditional royal ideology. The priests did not just accept her rule because she was pharaoh. They actively promoted her as someone the gods had specially chosen for greatness. And the evidence seemed to support their claims. Kemet, during Nefertari's reign, experienced a series of exceptionally good Nile floods, ensuring abundant harvests year after year. Trade expeditions returned with unprecedented wealth. No major plagues or natural disasters struck the kingdom. Even her enemies seemed to prosper from their relationships with Kemet to the ancient Egyptian mind. This pattern of success was proof of divine favor. The gods were clearly blessing Nefertari's reign, which meant opposing her was not just politically dangerous, but religiously forbidden. This brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of her rule. How did Nefertari handle the obvious problem of succession? She could not have children as pharaoh, at least not in the traditional sense. Egyptian royal ideology required the pharaoh to father the next generation of rulers. But Nefertari was a woman, and her stepson Amenhotep III was still alive, and theoretically, the rightful heir. Her solution was typically clever. Rather than trying to eliminate Amenhotep III or find a way to have her own children claim the throne, Nefertari positioned herself as a transitional ruler chosen by the gods to prepare Kemet for Amenhotep III's eventual reign. She presented her rule not as a permanent change to Egyptian succession law, but as a special divine intervention during a critical period in Egyptian history. This approach allowed her to maintain power while avoiding the appearance of completely overturning traditional succession. She was not stealing the throne from its rightful owner. She was preparing it for him. And the longer her reign continued to be successful, the more this narrative made sense to her subjects. Meanwhile, Amenhotep III was not sitting idle. As he grew to adulthood, Nefertari gradually gave him more responsibilities and more visible roles in government. He led military campaigns in her name, participated in religious ceremonies, and learned the complex skills of royal administration. To outside observers, it looked like a remarkably smooth preparation for eventual succession. But behind the scenes, tensions were building. As Amenhotep III matured and gained experience, he naturally began to develop his own ideas about how Kemet should be ruled. And those ideas did not always align with Nefertari's policies. The most significant difference was over military expansion. Nefertari's focus on trade and diplomacy had brought Kemet unprecedented wealth and stability, but it had also allowed some traditional Egyptian territories to assert more independence. Cities and regions that had paid tribute to previous pharaohs were now treating Kemet as an equal partner rather than an overlord. Amenhotep III, trained in traditional military leadership, saw this as weakness. In his view, Kemet's enemies were taking advantage of Nefertari's peaceful policies to prepare for future challenges to Egyptian dominance. He believed that only strong military action could maintain Kemet's position as the dominant regional power. These were not just abstract policy disagreements. They represented fundamentally different visions of what Kemet should be. Nefertari saw the kingdom as the center of a prosperous trading network, where wealth and influence came from being the partner everyone wanted to work with. Amenhotep III saw Kemet as a military empire, where respect and tribute came from being the power everyone was afraid to challenge. For years, these tensions remained below the surface. Nefertari was too successful, too popular, and too firmly established for Amenhotep III to challenge directly. But as her reign entered its third decade, subtle changes began to appear in official artwork and inscriptions. Images of Amenhotep III started appearing more frequently and more prominently. His name began appearing alongside Nefertari's in royal documents, suggesting a more equal partnership than before. New military preparations began, ostensibly for defensive purposes, but clearly designed to rebuild Kemet's capacity for major campaigns. Nefertari, now an experienced politician in her 50s, must have recognized these signs. But rather than trying to suppress Amenhotep III's growing influence, she made a decision that reveals both her political wisdom and her understanding of Egyptian royal ideology. She began preparing for her own transition out of power. This was not defeat. This was perhaps the most brilliant political maneuver of Nefertari's entire career. She understood something that many rulers throughout history have failed to grasp. The key to lasting power is not just knowing how to seize it or even how to keep it. It is knowing when and how to let it go. But here is where the story becomes absolutely fascinating, because Nefertari did not just quietly step aside like previous regents had done. Instead, she orchestrated what might be the most sophisticated political transition in ancient history. She was going to ensure that when she did step down, her legacy would be so firmly established that no one could ever question her legitimacy or erase her. Achievements. The first phase of her transition strategy was brilliant in its subtlety. Nefertari began sharing more ceremonial duties with Amenhotep III. But she made sure these were always presented as her graciously allowing him to participate in her divine authority, not as him reclaiming his rightful position. The message was clear. She was choosing to include him, which meant the power was still hers to give. At the same time, she accelerated her building programs to an almost frantic pace. New temples, expanded existing structures, more obelisks, additional inscriptions telling her story. This was not vanity. This was insurance. The more permanently her achievements were carved in stone, the harder it would be for future rulers to pretend she had never existed. But the most ingenious part of her strategy involved something that would seem completely counterintuitive to most rulers. Nefertari began actively promoting the idea that her reign had been divinely temporary. She commissioned new inscriptions describing how the gods had specifically chosen her to rule during a critical period in Egyptian history, and how they had now indicated that her sacred mission was complete. Think about how brilliant this was. By framing her eventual transition as fulfilling divine will rather than succumbing to political pressure, Nefertari maintained her religious authority even while preparing to give up temporal power. She was not being forced out. She was completing the sacred task the gods had assigned her. The historical records from this period are frustratingly incomplete. but we can piece together some incredible details about what was happening behind the scenes. Nefertari spent enormous resources on gifts and donations to temples throughout Kemet. She established new religious festivals that would ensure her name was spoken in prayers for generations. She even created special priesthoods dedicated to maintaining her memory and her cult after death. This was political genius operating on multiple levels simultaneously. Every gift to a temple created priests who had personal reasons to remember her favorably. Every new festival embedded her name deeper into Egyptian religious tradition. Every special priesthood gave her allies institutional power that would survive her reign. Meanwhile, Amenhotep III was making his own preparations. Historical records show that he began assembling military commanders who were loyal to him personally rather than to Nefertari. He started planning military campaigns that would restore Kemet's more aggressive imperial policies. He was essentially building a parallel government that could take control smoothly when the transition occurred. What makes this period so remarkable is that both rulers seem to have been preparing for the same transition, but for completely different reasons and with totally different expectations about what would happen afterward. Nefertari was preparing to step down as a successful pharaoh whose achievements would be celebrated forever. Amenhotep III was preparing to reclaim a throne that he believed had always rightfully been his. The tension between these two visions created one of the most fascinating power struggles in ancient history, and it was playing out entirely in public view. Every royal ceremony, every religious festival, every public appearance was simultaneously a demonstration of Nefertari's continuing authority and a rehearsal for Amenhotep III's eventual succession. Foreign ambassadors watching these events must have been completely baffled. Egyptian royal protocol had never dealt with anything like this situation. How do you pay proper respect to a female pharaoh who is preparing to transition power to a male heir who has technically been the rightful ruler for over 20 years? The diplomatic challenges alone were staggering. But here is what makes Nefertari's handling of this situation absolutely masterful. She managed to maintain complete royal dignity and authority, even while obviously preparing to give up power. Every public appearance reinforced her status as a legitimate pharaoh, while simultaneously demonstrating her wisdom and divine guidance in preparing for succession. The clearest evidence of her political skill during this period comes from the artwork and inscriptions created in the final years of her reign. Rather than showing any signs of weakness or uncertainty, these images depict Nefertari at the height of her power and glory. She is shown receiving tribute from foreign nations, making offerings to the gods, and overseeing massive construction projects. But subtle changes in the imagery reveal what was really happening. Amenhotep III appears more frequently and in more prominent positions. Sometimes he is shown performing royal duties independently, rather than just assisting Nefertari. The artistic evolution perfectly captures a gradual but deliberate transfer of authority. This brings us to one of the most mysterious aspects of Nefertari's story. Sometime around the 20th or 21st year of her reign, the historical record becomes much less clear. We know that Amenhotep III began ruling as sole pharaoh, but the exact circumstances of Nefertari's departure from power remain frustratingly vague. Some historians believe she died naturally, possibly from illness or old age. Others suggest she may have been forced to abdicate due to increasing pressure from military factions loyal to Amenhotep III. A few even propose that she voluntarily stepped down once she was satisfied that Kemet's transition would be smooth and her legacy secure. The truth is, we may never know exactly what happened, but we can analyze what came next. And that tells us everything we need to know about how successful Nefertari's political strategies really were. when Amenhotep III became sole ruler, he immediately began implementing the more aggressive military policies he had been planning. Within a few years, he launched a series of campaigns that restored Egyptian dominance over territories that had gained independence during Nefertari's peaceful reign. These campaigns were enormously successful, and Amenhotep III became known as one of Kemet's greatest military pharaohs. But here's the fascinating part. For the first 15 or 20 years of his solo reign, Amenhotep III made no attempt to erase Nefertari from the historical record. Her inscriptions remained intact. Her temples continued to function, and her religious festivals continued to be celebrated. This was not just tolerance. It was recognition that her reign had been legitimate and successful. Think about what this means. If Nefertari had been a usurper who had illegally seized power, Amenhotep III would have immediately begun destroying evidence of her reign. The fact that he did not suggest that even he acknowledged her right to have ruled her political strategy of positioning herself as a divinely chosen transitional ruler had worked perfectly. This period of coexistence between Nefertari's legacy and Amenhotep III's new policies reveals something crucial about ancient Egyptian political culture. Success mattered more than strict adherence to traditional gender roles. As long as a ruler was effective and brought prosperity to Kemet, the population and elite would support them regardless of whether they fit conventional expectations. But this delicate balance could not last forever. As Amenhotep III's own reign progressed and his military successes mounted, pressure began building to establish a clearer historical narrative that would emphasize traditional pharaonic masculinity and military achievement. The problem was that Nefertari's 22-year reign could not simply be ignored or forgotten. Too many people remembered it. Too many monuments celebrated it, and too many religious institutions depended on traditions she had established. Any attempt to erase her completely would have been obvious and potentially destabilizing. So instead, a more subtle campaign began. Rather than destroying Nefertari's monuments, workers began carefully chiseling away her images and names, replacing them with those of Amenhotep III or her husband, Amenhotep II. Rather than dismantling her religious festivals, they were gradually modified to honor different pharaohs. This process took decades and was never completely successful. The workers tasked with erasing Nefertari's legacy often did incomplete jobs, possibly because they personally remembered her reign fondly, or possibly because completely destroying such beautiful artwork felt wrong even to them. The result is that today we can still see evidence of this ancient cover-up. Walls that once showed Nefertari making offerings to the gods now show blank spaces where her figure was chiseled away. Inscriptions that once proclaimed her achievements now have different names, awkwardly inserted over obvious erasure marks. But ironically, this attempted erasure has actually helped preserve Nefertari's story for modern archaeologists. The incomplete nature of the destruction makes it obvious that something was deliberately hidden, which draws attention to what was removed. In many cases, enough traces remain that scholars can reconstruct the original images and inscriptions. More importantly, the physical evidence of Nefertari's achievements was too massive to destroy completely. Her temple still stands as one of the most impressive architectural accomplishments in Egyptian history. The obelisks she erected still tower over temple complexes. The trade relationships she established continued to bring wealth to Kemet for centuries. This brings us to perhaps the most important lesson from Nefertari's incredible story. Political power is ultimately about results, not just traditional authority. Nefertari succeeded as pharaoh, not because she found some loophole in Egyptian law that allowed women to rule, but because she was extraordinarily good at the actual job of ruling. She understood that successful leadership requires adapting to circumstances rather then rigidly following precedent. When Kemet needed military expansion, previous pharaohs had provided military expansion. When Kemet needed stability and prosperity, Nefertari provided stability and prosperity. Her willingness to break with tradition was not rebellion against Egyptian culture. It was responsiveness to Egyptian needs. This is why her reign was so successful and why attempts to erase her from history ultimately failed. You can destroy monuments and change inscriptions, but you cannot erase the memory of 22 years of peace and prosperity. You cannot undo successful trade relationships or pretend that architectural marvels were never built. The people who lived through Nefertari's reign knew what they had experienced, and they passed those memories to their children and grandchildren. Even when official history tried to ignore her, popular memory preserved the truth about Kemet's most successful female ruler. And this popular memory eventually influenced official history as well. Later Egyptian texts began mentioning Nefertari again, sometimes critically, but always acknowledging her existence and her achievements. By the time Greek historians like Herodotus began writing about Kemet, Nefertari's story had been partially restored to the historical record. The Greeks were particularly fascinated by her story because it challenged their own assumptions about gender and political power. Greek women had very limited political rights, so the idea of a female pharaoh who had successfully ruled one of the world's most powerful kingdoms for over 2 decades was almost incomprehensible to them. But the physical evidence was undeniable. Greek visitors to Kemet could see Nefertari's temples and obelisks. They could read inscriptions that clearly identified her as pharaoh. They could talk to Egyptian priests who still maintained traditions she had established. The reality of her achievements was impossible to ignore or explain away. This Greek fascination with Nefertari helped preserve her story through the Roman period and into the medieval era. While many other aspects of ancient Egyptian history were forgotten or distorted over the centuries, the basic facts about Kemet's female pharaoh survived in various forms. When modern archaeology began systematically studying ancient Kemet in the 19th century, Nefertari was one of the first pharaohs to be rediscovered and properly understood. The combination of surviving monuments, partially destroyed inscriptions, and ancient historical references made it relatively easy to reconstruct the basic outline of her reign. But the more archaeologists studied her story, the more remarkable it became. Each new discovery revealed additional evidence of her political sophistication, her architectural ambitions, and her economic success. What had initially seemed like an interesting historical anomaly gradually emerged as one of the most impressive examples of effective leadership in the ancient world. Today, Nefertari is recognized not just as an important female ruler, but as one of Kemet's greatest pharaohs, regardless of gender. Her reign is studied as a masterclass in political strategy, economic development, and architectural innovation. Her story has become an inspiration for women in leadership positions around the world. But perhaps most importantly, Nefertari's legacy demonstrates something crucial about human potential and political possibility. She proved that effective leadership transcends traditional categories and expectations. When circumstances require it, extraordinary people can step beyond conventional roles and achieve extraordinary things. Her story reminds us that history is shaped not just by those who follow established patterns, but by those who have the courage and skill to create new ones when the situation demands it. Nefertari did not just rule Kemet. She expanded our understanding of what rulership could be. And that is a legacy that no amount of chiseling away at monuments could ever truly erase. The question that intrigues historians today is this: what if Nefertari had been born male? Would she be remembered alongside Ramesses the Great and Akhenaten as one of Kemet's most legendary pharaohs? The uncomfortable truth is that gender bias has shaped how we view ancient rulers for millennia. And Nefertari's story forces us to confront that bias directly. But here is what makes her achievements even more extraordinary. She did not just succeed despite being female in a male-dominated world. She succeeded so completely that she redefined what pharaonic power could look like. Her reign was not just an exception to Egyptian royal tradition. It was an evolution of it. Let us delve deeper into how Nefertari's political genius actually functioned on a daily basis, because this is where her story becomes absolutely captivating. Most pharaohs ruled through a combination of divine authority, military power, and bureaucratic control. Nefertari had to add another layer, constant political theater, designed to reinforce her legitimacy. Every public appearance was choreographed to demonstrate that the gods supported her rule. Every royal ceremony included elements that emphasized her divine selection. Every administrative decision was presented not just as royal policy, but as the fulfillment of divine will. This was not propaganda in the modern sense. This was sophisticated political communication designed to maintain stability in an unprecedented situation. Consider what this meant for her daily routine. While male pharaohs could simply issue commands and expect obedience, Nefertari had to constantly demonstrate that her commands carried divine authority. She could not just wear the crown and false beard during major ceremonies. She had to embody the role of pharaoh so completely that everyone around her would forget they were dealing with something historically unusual. This required an incredible level of personal discipline and political awareness. One mistake, one moment of appearing uncertain or illegitimate, could have triggered a crisis that would end her reign and possibly destabilize the entire kingdom. The pressure must have been enormous, but historical records suggest she handled it with remarkable grace and skill. Her court officials seem to have genuinely respected her judgment and ability. Foreign ambassadors wrote dispatches describing her as a formidable negotiator and a shrewd political strategist. Even her potential enemies within Kemet appeared to have grudgingly admired her effectiveness as a ruler. This brings us to one of the most impressive aspects of Nefertari's reign: her ability to manage competing factions within Egyptian society. Ancient Kemet was not a monolithic kingdom where the pharaoh's word was automatically accepted. It was a complex collection of regional interests. Religious institutions, military commanders, and noble families, all with their own agendas and power bases. Previous pharaohs had typically managed these factions through a combination of rewards, threats, and military force. Nefertari developed a more sophisticated approach based on creating mutual benefit and shared prosperity. Instead of demanding loyalty through fear, she earned it through results. Take her relationship with the military, for example. Traditional Egyptian pharaohs were expected to be warrior kings who personally led armies in the battle. Nefertari could not fulfill this role in the conventional sense, but she found ways to keep military leaders satisfied and loyal. She increased military budgets and improved soldiers' equipment and pay. She commissioned impressive military monuments and ceremonies that honored Kemet's martial traditions. Most importantly, she used Kemet's growing wealth to fund military infrastructure, projects that enhanced the kingdom's defensive capabilities without requiring expensive foreign campaigns. The result was a military that remained loyal and effective, even though it was not being used for constant expansion. When occasional border conflicts did arise, Egyptian forces under Nefertari's command performed well, demonstrating that her peaceful policies had not weakened Kemet's ability to defend itself. Her approach to the nobility was equally clever. Rather than trying to suppress potential rivals or force them into submission, Nefertari created opportunities for advancement and enrichment that made supporting her regime more profitable than opposing it. She expanded the royal bureaucracy, creating new positions and responsibilities that gave ambitious nobles productive outlets for their energy. She also used her building projects as a form of economic stimulus that benefited noble families throughout Kemet. Major construction projects required enormous amounts of materials, labor, and logistical coordination. Noble families who controlled quarries, transportation networks, or skilled craftsmen found themselves prospering as never before. This created a network of economic interests that had powerful reasons to support Nefertari's continued rule. Even nobles who might have preferred a traditional male pharaoh had to acknowledge that challenging her would threaten their own prosperity and that of their dependents. But perhaps her most brilliant political achievement was how she handled Kemet's relationship with neighboring kingdoms. Traditional Egyptian foreign policy had been based on demonstrating superior military power and extracting tribute through the threat of the expedition. The punt was not just about acquiring exotic goods. It was about demonstrating a new model of international relations based on cooperation rather than domination. The success of this expedition encouraged other kingdoms to seek similar arrangements with Kemet, transforming the country from a military empire into the center of a vast commercial network. This shift had profound implications for Egyptian society. Military campaigns had traditionally been the primary source of wealth for the kingdom, but they also drained resources and created risks. Trade relationships generated wealth more consistently and with far less risk, allowing Kemet to prosper without the constant threat of military disaster. Foreign rulers who had once feared Egyptian armies now competed to become Kemet's preferred trading partners. Diplomatic marriages, commercial agreements, and cultural exchanges replaced military campaigns as the primary tools of Egyptian foreign policy. The result was unprecedented stability and prosperity throughout the region. But Nefertari's innovations went beyond politics and economics. She also transformed Egyptian architecture and art in ways that influenced the kingdom's culture for centuries. Her building projects were not just impressive monuments. They were experiments in new forms of artistic expression that reflected her unique position in Egyptian history. Traditional pharaonic art had followed strict conventions designed to emphasize the ruler's divine nature and masculine authority. Nefertari's artists had to develop new visual languages that could convey the same messages while accommodating her unprecedented circumstances. The result was some of the most innovative and beautiful art in Egyptian history. Her mortuary temple was not just architecturally revolutionary. It was a masterpiece of artistic integration that combined sculpture, painting, and architecture into a unified statement about divine kingship and royal legitimacy. The scenes depicting her divine birth and coronation represent some of the most sophisticated narrative art ever created in ancient Kemet. These were not just decorative images. They were complex theological and political arguments presented in visual form, designed to convince viewers that Nefertari's rule was not only legitimate, but divinely ordained. Her artists also developed new ways of depicting royal power that influenced Egyptian art for generations. The integration of natural landscape elements into architectural design, the use of terrace construction to create dramatic visual effects, and the sophisticated interplay between interior and exterior spaces all became standard features of later Egyptian architecture. Even the controversial images of Nefertari wearing masculine royal regalia represent artistic innovation rather than simple imitation of male pharaonic imagery. Her artists created visual representations that conveyed divine kingship while acknowledging the unique circumstances of her reign. These images were not trying to make Nefertari look like a man. They were trying to show how divine kingship could transcend conventional gender categories. This artistic revolution reflected deeper changes in Egyptian Religious and political thought. Nefertari's reign forced Egyptian intellectuals to reconsider fundamental assumptions about rulership, divine authority, and social organization. The theological justifications created for her reign expanded Egyptian understanding of how the gods could work through human agents. Her religious innovations were equally significant. While maintaining traditional Egyptian religious practices, Nefertari introduced new elements that emphasized the flexibility and responsiveness of divine will. Her reign demonstrated that the gods could choose unconventional agents when circumstances required it, expanding Egyptian theology in ways that influenced religious thought for centuries. The festivals and ceremonies she established often incorporated themes of divine adaptation and renewal, reflecting her own experience of transforming from queen to pharaoh in response to divine calling. These religious innovations helped normalize the idea that traditional roles and expectations could evolve when necessary to serve higher purposes. Her patronage of existing religious institutions was equally transformative. Rather than simply maintaining traditional practices, Nefertari invested in expanding and improving religious infrastructure throughout Kemet. She did not just restore old temples. She rebuilt them on scales that surpassed anything previously seen. The economic impact of these religious investments was enormous. Temple construction projects provided employment for thousands of workers, from skilled artisans to common laborers. The expanded temple complexes required permanent staff to maintain and operate them, creating long-term economic opportunities in communities throughout Kemet. But more importantly, these religious investments demonstrated Nefertari's commitment to Egyptian cultural traditions, even while she was transforming Egyptian political traditions. By becoming the greatest patron of traditional religion in Egyptian history, she proved that innovation and tradition could coexist and mutually reinforce each other. This balance between innovation and tradition became one of the defining characteristics of her reign. She did not reject Egyptian culture in order to claim power. Instead, she found ways to expand Egyptian culture to accommodate new possibilities while preserving its essential character. Her approach to royal succession planning demonstrates this balance perfectly. Rather than trying to establish a new dynastic line or permanently alter Egyptian succession law, Nefertari positioned her reign as a temporary divine intervention that would ultimately restore traditional succession patterns. This allowed her to maintain power without threatening the fundamental stability of Egyptian political institutions. She was not trying to destroy the existing system. She was trying to help it navigate an unprecedented crisis in a way that would preserve its long-term viability. The gradual transition of authority to Amenhotep III represented the successful completion of this mission. By the time he became sole pharaoh, Kemet was more prosperous, more stable, and more secure than it had been when Nefertari first became regent. Her temporary innovation had strengthened rather than weakened traditional Egyptian institutions. This is why Amenhotep III initially preserved rather than destroyed evidence of her reign. He understood that her rule had been beneficial to Kemet, and that attempting to erase it completely would be both historically dishonest and politically dangerous. The later campaign to diminish her legacy came from different political pressures and represented a less sophisticated understanding of what she had accomplished. But here is what makes Nefertari's story absolutely crucial for understanding ancient Kemet and political leadership in general. She proved that effective governance transcends conventional categories and expectations. Her success was not achieved by rejecting femininity or pretending to be something she was not. It was achieved by demonstrating that leadership ability is more important than conformity to traditional roles. This lesson resonated throughout Egyptian history, and influenced how later rulers approached the challenges of governance. Several subsequent pharaohs adopted elements of Nefertari's political and economic strategies, particularly her emphasis on trade relationships and monumental construction projects. Her architectural innovations became standard features of Egyptian royal building, and her diplomatic approaches influenced Egyptian foreign policy for centuries. Even her religious innovations continued to shape Egyptian theology long after her death. More broadly, Nefertari's reign demonstrated that political institutions can adapt and evolve without losing their essential character. Her temporary transformation of pharaonic rulership helped preserve, rather than destroy, Egyptian political stability during a critical period in the kingdom's history. This flexibility and adaptability became one of the sources of Kemet's remarkable longevity as a civilization. While other ancient kingdoms collapsed when faced with unprecedented challenges, Kemet developed the capacity to innovate and adapt while maintaining cultural continuity. Nefertari's story also reveals something important about the relationship between individual leadership and historical change. She did not succeed simply because she was an exceptional person, although she certainly was that. She succeeded because she understood how to work within existing systems, while gradually transforming them to meet new needs. Her political genius lay not in rejecting Egyptian traditions, but in finding ways to expand them. She did not try to impose foreign models of governance on Kemet. Instead, she developed uniquely Egyptian solutions to uniquely Egyptian problems. This approach required an extraordinary combination of political skill, cultural sensitivity, and personal courage. She had to be bold enough to break with precedent while being careful enough not to trigger destructive conflicts. She had to be innovative enough to solve new problems while being traditional enough to maintain legitimacy. The fact that she sustained this delicate balance for over 2 decades while achieving remarkable success demonstrates a level of political sophistication that few rulers in any era have matched. Her reign represents one of the great achievements in the history of governance and leadership. But perhaps most importantly, Nefertari's story challenges us to reconsider our assumptions about historical possibility and human potential. Her success proves that extraordinary circumstances can create opportunities for extraordinary people to achieve extraordinary things, regardless of conventional limitations and expectations. Her legacy reminds us that history is shaped not just by those who follow established patterns, but by those who have the vision and skill to create new patterns when circumstances demanded. She did not just rule Kemet effectively. She expanded our understanding of what effective rulership could look like, and that expansion of possibility, that demonstration that traditional limitations are not absolute limitations, may be her most important contribution to human history. She proved that when the situation requires it, exceptional people can transcend conventional categories and achieve the seemingly impossible. This is why attempts to erase her from history ultimately failed, and why her story continues to inspire people today. You can destroy monuments and change inscriptions, but you cannot erase the fundamental truth that she demonstrated. Human potential is not limited by traditional expectations, and exceptional circumstances can create opportunities for exceptional achievements. Nefertari did not just become pharaoh despite being a woman in ancient Kemet. She became one of Kemet's greatest pharaohs precisely because she brought unique perspectives and approaches to the challenges of rulership. Her gender was not an obstacle she overcame. It was one of the sources of her distinctive strengths as a leader. This reframing of her story transforms our understanding not just of ancient Kemet, but of leadership itself. She shows us that diversity of experience and perspective can be a source of strength rather than weakness. and that the most effective solutions to complex problems often come from those who approach them from unexpected angles. Her 22-year reign stands as proof that when we expand our definitions of who can lead and how leadership can be exercised, we create opportunities for innovations and achievements that would otherwise be impossible. And that may be the most important lesson from the incredible story of Nefertari, the queen who became pharaoh and, in doing so, redefined what both queenship and kingship could mean. But what happened next reveals the true measure of Nefertari's political genius and shows us why her story becomes even more extraordinary as we approach its conclusion. When modern archaeologists first began seriously studying Nefertari in the 20th century, they made discoveries that completely changed our understanding of her reign and its aftermath. The evidence they uncovered tells a story far more complex and fascinating than the simple narrative of a female pharaoh who was later erased from history. Let us start with what they found at her mortuary temple. When archaeologists began systematic excavations, they expected to find evidence of deliberate destruction and erasure. What they actually discovered was far more intriguing. Yes, many of Nefertari's images have been chiseled away, but the work was selective, careful, and in many cases incomplete. More importantly, they found evidence that the temple had continued to function as an active religious site for centuries after Nefertari's death. Priests had maintained her cult. Pilgrims had continued to visit, and later pharaohs had actually added their own inscriptions and decorations to the complex. This was not the behavior you would expect if Nefertari had been completely discredited or forgotten. The archaeological evidence suggests something much more nuanced than historical erasure. It appears that different pharaohs at different times had different attitudes toward Nefertari's legacy, and these attitudes were influenced by changing political circumstances rather than simple gender bias. For example, some of the defacement appears to have occurred during periods when Kemet was facing military threats and needed to emphasize traditional warrior kingship. During peaceful periods, Nefertari's monuments were often restored and maintained. This pattern suggests that her legacy was used as a political tool by later rulers rather than being systematically suppressed. But the most remarkable discovery was what archaeologists found when they looked beyond the obvious monuments scattered throughout Kemet. In smaller temples and local shrines, they found hundreds of inscriptions and images of Nefertari that had never been touched by later defacement campaigns. These discoveries revealed that her impact on Egyptian society had been far broader and deeper than anyone had previously understood. Local communities throughout Kemet had commissioned their own monuments honoring Nefertari during her reign. These were not royal projects mandated by the central government. They were grassroots expressions of genuine popular support and admiration. The fact that these local monuments survived suggests that Nefertari's reputation among ordinary Egyptians remained positive long after her death. Even more fascinating, archaeologists began finding evidence that some of Nefertari's innovations had become permanent. Features of Egyptian culture. Administrative documents from centuries after her death show government officials using bureaucratic procedures she had established. Religious texts show prayers and ceremonies she had created still being performed. Economic records show trade relationships she had initiated still generating wealth for Kemet. This evidence reveals that while later pharaohs may have tried to diminish Nefertari's personal legacy, they could not undo the practical improvements she had made to Egyptian society. Her reign had created institutional changes that were too beneficial to abandon, even when her memory was being officially suppressed. The discovery of her actual mummy in 2007 provided even more insights into her story. Modern forensic analysis revealed that Nefertari had lived to be around 50 years old, which was quite advanced for ancient Kemet. She showed signs of diabetes and possibly bone disease, but also evidence of having lived a physically active and well-nourished life consistent with royal status. More intriguingly, analysis of her mummy and burial goods suggested that she had been given full pharaonic burial honors, including mummification techniques reserved for legitimate rulers. If she had been considered a usurper, she would never have received this treatment. The fact that she was buried with all the dignity and ceremony appropriate to a pharaoh proves that her legitimacy was recognized even after her death. The location where her mummy was found also tells us something important. She was not buried in her magnificent mortuary temple. Instead, she was interred in a simple tomb in the Valley of the Queens alongside other legitimate pharaohs. This suggests that even if later rulers wanted to diminish her public legacy, they still acknowledged her right to rest among Kemet's royal dead. But perhaps the most significant recent discovery has been the identification of inscriptions that appear to have been created during the final years of Nefertari's reign. These texts provide our clearest evidence of how she managed her transition out of power and what she expected her legacy to be. The inscriptions describe Nefertari as completing a sacred mission assigned to her by the gods. They present her reign not as a permanent change to Egyptian succession law, but as a temporary divine intervention that had successfully restored stability and prosperity to Kemet. Most importantly, they describe her voluntary transfer of power to Amenhotep III as the final act of her divinely appointed role. This evidence supports the theory that Nefertari orchestrated her own transition rather than being forced from power. She had spent years preparing Kemet for Amenhotep III's sole rule. And when the time came, she stepped aside gracefully, confident that her achievements would speak for themselves. The inscriptions also reveal something remarkable about her final political strategy. Rather than trying to ensure that her immediate successors would continue her policies, Nefertari focused on creating institutional changes that would survive regardless of who held power. She embedded her innovations so deeply into Egyptian government, religion, and culture that they became permanent features of the civilization. This long-term thinking demonstrates a level of political sophistication that sets Nefertari apart from most rulers throughout history. She understood that individual leaders are temporary, but institutional changes can be permanent. By focusing on transforming Egyptian systems rather than just exercising personal power, she ensured that her impact would outlast any attempts to diminish her memory. Modern analysis of Egyptian economic records from the centuries following her reign confirms that this strategy worked. Kemet continued to benefit from the trade relationships she had established, the administrative procedures she had created, and the religious innovations she had introduced long after her personal legacy had been officially suppressed. Her architectural legacy was equally enduring. The building techniques pioneered at her temple influenced Egyptian construction for the rest of the pharaonic period. Later, pharaohs repeatedly tried to copy the visual impact of her terrace temple design, though none ever matched its elegance and integration with the natural landscape. The artistic innovations developed during her reign also became standard features of Egyptian royal art. The sophisticated use of narrative scenes to convey complex political and religious messages, the integration of architectural and sculptural elements, and the development of new visual symbols for divine kingship all became permanent parts of Egyptian artistic tradition. But beyond these concrete legacies, Nefertari's reign had a more subtle but perhaps more important impact on Egyptian political culture. She had demonstrated that effective governance was more important than rigid adherence to traditional roles and expectations. This lesson influenced how later pharaohs approached the challenges of rulership. Subsequent Egyptian rulers showed greater flexibility in adapting to unusual circumstances, greater willingness to experiment with new policies, and greater sensitivity to the need to justify their innovations in terms of Egyptian traditions and values. While they may not have explicitly credited Nefertari for these approaches, the precedent she had established clearly influenced their thinking. Her reign also appears to have influenced Egyptian attitudes toward female political participation more generally. While no other woman achieved the throne as sole pharaoh for centuries after Nefertari, several queens during the later New Kingdom period exercised far more political influence than their predecessors had. Royal women became more involved in diplomatic negotiations, religious ceremonies, and even military planning. This gradual expansion of female political roles suggests that Nefertari's reign had shifted Egyptian thinking about gender and governance in lasting ways. She had proved that women could exercise supreme political authority effectively. And while this lesson may have been officially suppressed, it appears to have influenced actual political practice. The international impact of her reign was equally significant. Foreign kingdoms that had developed trade relationships with Kemet during Nefertari's rule continued to prefer diplomatic and commercial solutions to conflicts rather than military ones. The model of international relations she had pioneered became increasingly common throughout the ancient Near East. Later Egyptian pharaohs found that they could often achieve their foreign policy objectives through the threat of cutting off profitable trade relationships rather than through military conquest. This approach was generally less expensive and more sustainable than traditional imperial expansion, and it became a standard tool of Egyptian diplomacy. Archaeological evidence from neighboring kingdoms shows Egyptian goods, artistic styles, and cultural practices spreading throughout the region during and after Nefertari's reign. This cultural influence was often more enduring than military conquest, creating lasting connections between Kemet and other civilizations. The Greek historians who later wrote about Kemet were particularly impressed by evidence of these cultural exchanges. They described Kemet during Nefertari's era as the center of an international network of cities and kingdoms that competed to imitate Egyptian achievements rather than to resist Egyptian power. This transformation from military empire to cultural hegemon represented one of Nefertari's most important contributions to ancient history. She had shown that a kingdom could maintain dominance through attraction rather than coercion, through offering benefits rather than threatening punishment. The Roman historians who inherited Greek accounts of Egyptian history were even more fascinated by this aspect of her reign. Rome itself had achieved dominance, primarily through military conquest. But Roman intellectuals were increasingly interested in alternative models of imperial governance that might be more sustainable and less expensive to maintain. Some Roman political theorists explicitly cited Nefertari's reign as an example of how effective civilian leadership could achieve better results than military conquest. While Rome never fully adopted her approaches, her example influenced Roman thinking about provincial administration and diplomatic relations. The preservation of her story through these classical sources ensured that knowledge of her achievements survived even when Egyptian civilization itself declined. Medieval scholars had access to Greek and Roman accounts of her reign, and these accounts helped maintain awareness of her historical importance. When European scholars began systematic study of ancient Kemet during the Renaissance, Nefertari was one of the first pharaohs they were able to identify and understand. The combination of classical historical accounts and surviving monuments made her story relatively easy to reconstruct. Compared to other ancient rulers, This early scholarly attention helped establish Nefertari as an important historical figure in European consciousness, centuries before modern archaeology fully revealed the extent of her achievements. By the time systematic excavation began in Kemet, she was already recognized as one of ancient history's most significant female rulers. The 19th and early 20th century archaeological discoveries that filled in the details of her story only confirmed what classical sources had suggested. She had not just been an interesting historical anomaly. She had been one of the most effective rulers in Egyptian history, whose innovations had influenced the development of civilization itself. Modern historians have understandably embraced Nefertari as a symbol of female political capability, but her significance extends far beyond gender issues. Her reign demonstrates universal principles of effective leadership that apply regardless of the leader's identity or the specific challenges they face. She showed that successful governance requires adapting to circumstances rather than rigidly following precedent. She proved that innovation and tradition can reinforce each other when skillfully balanced. She demonstrated that long-term institutional change is more important than short-term personal power. Perhaps most importantly, she established that political legitimacy ultimately depends on results rather than conventional qualifications. Her reign succeeded because it made Kemet more prosperous, more stable, and more secure. Not because she met traditional expectations for pharaonic rulership. These lessons remain relevant for political leaders today. In our rapidly changing world, the ability to adapt to new circumstances while maintaining institutional stability is more important than ever. Nefertari's example shows how this balance can be achieved through skillful political leadership. Her story also demonstrates the importance of thinking beyond immediate political survival toward long-term institutional health. Too many modern leaders focus exclusively on maintaining their personal power rather than on creating lasting improvements to the systems they govern. Nefertari understood that true political success means leaving institutions stronger than you found them, even if that means accepting constraints on your personal authority. Her willingness to prepare for her own transition out of power ensured that her innovations would survive and benefit future generations. The modern rediscovery of her story has also provided important insights into how historical narratives are constructed and maintained. The fact that such a significant ruler could be partially erased from history demonstrates how political considerations can distort our understanding of the past, but it also shows that truth has a way of surviving attempts at suppression. The physical evidence of Nefertari's achievements was too substantial to destroy completely, and the beneficial effects of her innovations were too obvious to ignore indefinitely. Her story reminds us to be skeptical of official historical narratives and to look for evidence of voices and perspectives that may have been deliberately suppressed. How many other important historical figures have been diminished or forgotten because they did not fit conventional expectations? The ongoing archaeological work in Kemet continues to reveal new evidence about Nefertari's reign and its impact. Recent discoveries suggest that her influence on Egyptian culture may have been even greater than previously understood, and that the attempt to erase her legacy was less successful than once believed. These discoveries are gradually reshaping our understanding of ancient Egyptian politics, gender relations, and cultural development. They are also providing new insights into the mechanisms by which historical memory is preserved, distorted, and recovered. But perhaps the most important lesson from Nefertari's story is about the relationship between individual agency and historical change. She succeeded not because she was somehow exempt from the constraints that limited other women in ancient Kemet, but because she found ways to work within and gradually transform those constraints. Her example shows that even apparently rigid social and political systems contain possibilities for change when approached with sufficient skill, patience, and strategic thinking. She did not wait for Egyptian society to accept female pharaohs. She created the conditions that made her own acceptance possible. This approach required extraordinary personal courage and political skill, but it also required a deep understanding of Egyptian culture and values. She succeeded because she found ways to present her innovations as fulfillments of Egyptian traditions rather than rejections of them. Her story demonstrates that effective social change often comes from working within existing systems, rather than trying to overthrow them completely. Revolutionary approaches may seem more dramatic, but evolutionary approaches are often more successful and more sustainable. The fact that many of her innovations became permanent features of Egyptian civilization proves the effectiveness of this evolutionary strategy. By embedding her changes deeply within existing institutions and cultural practices, she ensured their survival even when her personal legacy was under attack. This patient, strategic approach to creating lasting change remains relevant for anyone working to reform institutions or challenge established practices. Nefertari's example shows that it is possible to achieve radical transformation through careful, sustained effort that respects cultural values while gradually expanding their application. Her reign stands as one of history's great examples of transformational leadership, demonstrating how exceptional individuals can create lasting change by finding ways to work within existing systems while gradually expanding their possibilities. The continuing fascination with her story more than 3,000 years after her death testifies to the enduring relevance of the lessons her reign provides about leadership, political innovation, and the potential for individuals to shape the course of history. The woman who became pharaoh did not just break barriers. She showed us how barriers can be transformed into opportunities when approached with sufficient intelligence, courage, and strategic vision. That lesson, carved in stone and preserved in the institutional changes that outlasted all attempts at erasure, remains as relevant today as it was over 3 millennia ago, when Nefertari first donned the false beard of kingship and changed the world. And so, dear listener, as we reach the gentle conclusion of Nefertari's remarkable journey, we find ourselves not at an ending, but at a beginning. Her story continues to whisper across the centuries, reminding us that when extraordinary people encounter extraordinary circumstances and respond with extraordinary wisdom, they can achieve things that permanently expand our understanding of what is possible. In the quiet hours, when you reflect upon her legacy, remember that Nefertari did not just rule an ancient kingdom. She demonstrated that the boundaries we accept as unchangeable are often merely the limits of our imagination. She proved that with patience, wisdom, and unwavering determination, even the most entrenched traditions can evolve to embrace new possibilities. As you drift into peaceful rest tonight, let her story be a gentle reminder that history belongs not just to those who follow well-worn paths, but to those brave enough to create new ones when circumstances demand it. The radiant queen who became pharaoh showed us that leadership is not about conforming to expectations, but about rising to meet the needs of those we serve. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere in the ancient sands of Kemet, the monuments she built still stand as testament to what becomes possible when vision meets courage, when tradition embraces innovation, and when one extraordinary person dares to imagine a better world and then creates it. May her wisdom guide your dreams, and may you wake knowing that you too carry within yourself the power to transform the impossible into the inevitable. Good night, dear listener, and thank you for joining me in this gentle journey through time.